Many businesses look at pipeline size and assume they are safe. There are opportunities open, there are conversations happening, there are deals in progress, so the pipeline appears healthy. But a full pipeline is not the same as enough pipeline. That distinction matters because opportunity count is one of the easiest things to misread. A business may have many open opportunities and still not have enough real coverage to support the revenue it needs. Why? Because count alone says almost nothing about the actual weight inside the pipeline. 10 weak opportunities do not create the same protection as 3 strong ones. A pipeline with many open names can still be too thin. It can look active, busy, and populated while carrying far less real future value than the business assumes. This is where false security begins. The team sees volume and feels less urgency. The business sees activity and assumes enough is forming. But coverage is not about how many opportunities exist. It is about whether the pipeline contains enough credible value to support future revenue realistically. That is a harder question, because it forces the business to look past surface volume and ask what the pipeline can actually carry. How much confidence exists? How much real movement exists? How much of the pipeline still deserves meaningful belief? Without that discipline, opportunity count becomes comforting in the wrong way. It creates the appearance of strength without proving that enough revenue is actually being built underneath. That is why pipeline coverage matters more than opportunity count. Count shows presence. Coverage shows whether the business is truly protected or only temporarily reassured.
What makes this mistake dangerous is that count feels objective. The business can point to the pipeline and say, "We have enough opportunities open." That sounds disciplined. But the number itself does not answer the question that actually matters. Enough for what? Enough to support this month? Enough to support next month? Enough to absorb losses? Enough to survive weaker conversion than expected? Enough to carry the revenue target with realistic confidence? That is where coverage becomes more useful than count. Coverage asks whether the pipeline holds enough weighted value to support the outcome the business needs. Not hopeful value, not open status, weighted value. Value adjusted for strength, timing, movement, and confidence. Without that adjustment, count becomes misleading very quickly. A pipeline can be numerically large and still commercially fragile. Some opportunities may be weak, some may be aging. Some may be technically open without carrying enough current momentum to deserve serious forecast weight. If those cases remain inside the same mental category as healthier opportunities, the pipeline starts looking safer than it really is. That creates late awareness. The business sees volume and reacts too slowly. It assumes there is enough future revenue forming when the real coverage underneath may already be too thin. This is why count should never be the main comfort signal. Coverage is harder, but it is more honest, because it asks not how much is visible, but how much is actually strong enough to support the business with real confidence.
This is why pipeline coverage changes the way the business reads risk. A weak pipeline does not always look empty. Sometimes it looks busy. There are names in motion, there are calls happening, there are updates in the system, so the business feels less exposed than it actually is. But exposure is not reduced by visible activity alone. It is reduced when enough credible pipeline exists to absorb uncertainty. That means enough weight to survive slower movement, enough strength to absorb normal loss, and enough real momentum to make the revenue target more than a hopeful guess. Without that, the pipeline may still look alive, but it is not giving the business enough protection. This is where count becomes dangerous. It hides thinness behind visibility. A pipeline with many opportunities can still fail to cover the outcome required if too much of that volume is weak, stalled, or carrying outdated confidence. That is why coverage is a much better operating signal. It forces the business to think in terms of sufficiency, not just presence. Not do we have opportunities, but do we have enough weighted opportunity to support what we need next? That question is harder, but it
creates better judgment. Because once the business starts reading coverage, it becomes less likely to confuse activity with safety, and less likely to discover too late that the pipeline looked fuller than it actually was.
A stronger pipeline does not only track what is open, it asks how much of what is open still deserves real confidence. That is what makes coverage useful. Because coverage forces the business to weigh opportunity quality, not just opportunity presence. A lead that is technically active but weak in movement should not carry the same protective value as a healthier case. An older opportunity that is still visible but no longer earning strong confidence should not make the pipeline feel safer than it really is. This is where many businesses underestimate risk. They see enough open cases and assume enough future revenue is forming. But if the underlying weight is too soft, the pipeline is not providing real protection. It is only delaying the moment when the shortfall becomes obvious. That is why coverage matters so much. It helps the business see whether the current pipeline is truly strong enough to support the outcome required, or whether it is only creating a temporary sense of security. That difference changes behavior. A business that reads count may stay passive too long. A business that reads coverage becomes more alert earlier. It can see when acquisition needs help, when confidence is too thin, and when visible activity is not enough to carry the target safely. That is the real advantage. Coverage does not make the pipeline look bigger. It makes the pipeline look truer. And truth is what helps the business respond before weakness turns into surprise. This is also why pipeline coverage should influence urgency much earlier than most businesses expect. When coverage is weak, the problem is not only future revenue, the problem is timing. Because once the business notices that coverage is too thin, there is usually less time left to rebuild enough pipelines safely. That is what makes weak coverage so expensive. It creates late reactions. The business realizes that there are not enough strong opportunities, but by then, acquisition pressure increases, decision quality weakens, and the team starts trying to compensate under time pressure. A healthier system prevents that. It treats coverage as an early signal, not as a late surprise. It asks, do we have enough weighted opportunity to support what is coming next? Not just eventually, not in theory, soon enough to matter. That changes the quality of planning. Because once coverage is read honestly, the business can react while there is still room to improve the pipeline with discipline. Without that, it waits too long, trusts raw volume too much, and mistakes visible activity for real protection. That is why coverage matters more than opportunity count. Count may reduce anxiety. Coverage reduces risk. And those are not the same thing.
When a business reads coverage well, the pipeline stops being just a list of opportunities and starts becoming a measure of protection. That is the real shift. The question is no longer how many deals do we have open. It becomes how much real support does this pipeline still give the revenue we need? That is a much better standard. Because a business is not protected by names in the system. It is protected by enough weighted opportunity to carry the target with believable strength. Once that logic becomes normal, decision-making improves immediately. Weak coverage becomes visible sooner. False comfort becomes easier to challenge. And the business becomes less likely to confuse pipeline size with pipeline sufficiency. That matters because count can stay high while protection keeps getting weaker. Coverage exposes that gap. It shows when the pipeline still looks active, but no longer carries enough real strength to justify the same level of confidence. That is why coverage matters more than count. Count describes what is there. Coverage helps the business understand whether what is there is actually enough. And that is the judgment that protects planning, improves timing, and makes the pipeline far more useful as a real operating signal. Because once the business starts reading coverage honestly, it becomes much harder for visible activity alone to disguise structural weakness underneath.